Hello and welcome to the podcast. So I'll start by saying at the end of this podcast, I'll answer some of the most commonly raised questions from the comments on the video format. It's quite worth listening to, as perhaps if you do have a question, it might be answered there. Also, I do forget to convert a unit in one section. I state the Bell 212 has an operational capacity of 5,000 kilograms when it's actually 5,000 pounds. So it actually 2,268 kilo. This doesn't actually detract from the material calculations section though, as I think all of the lower bounds, most of the middle bounds, and the upper bounds for the 2024 ALU, the Aramid, the glass composite all remain below and easily within this. Also, a further note to this, fuselage mass in modern transport aircraft can be around a fuselage percent of about 22% of operational empty mass. One recent aircraft design actually has 8,500 kilogram fuselage from a 38,000 kilogram operational empty mass. So if the egg also is generally monocoque object, then many of the percentages, even allowing for this error, could still fall within this. I'll address further questions at the end of the episode anyway. I hope you enjoy. Don't forget to check out the YouTube channel, Plausible ? Or I think it's also at Sheridan's Online. Hope you enjoy the episode. Catch you at the end. Welcome back. So in this episode, we're looking into the recent story of UFOs on the moon. The story is summarized as astronomers at the Ukrainian National Laboratory have written a paper with claims of anywhere between objects between the sizes of 14 to 36 kilometers in size, and also traveling up to about 11 kilometers per second, which works out as about 25,000 miles per hour. This was near the moon. So I want to say from the outset that I'm not going to tell you that there is a 36 kilometer alien spacecraft orbiting the moon traveling at these speeds. I can't establish that from the evidence we currently have, but equally, after looking into the people behind this research, the equipment they used, the methodology, and also the criticism of the work, and then digging into some of NASA's own lunar data sets, I don't think this deserves to be laughed away either, because underneath the extraordinary headline is actually a much more interesting question of what did these astronomers actually observe? And perhaps just as importantly, has anyone actually explained this? Also, I look into some of NASA's data. So we'll start with the UFO moon story and end with NASA. To start with, let's look at the people responsible for the paper, because when you hear claims of enormous unidentified objects apparently moving across the moon, the immediate assumption might be that we're dealing with some fringe UFO group using questionable equipment. The lead author appears to be one Boris Zyliev. So Zyliev is a professional astrophysicist with a publication history stretching back decades. ResearchGate currently lists more than 170 publications associated with him, and he is listed as the head of the Laboratory for Transient Phenomena in Stars at the main astronomical observatory of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. And something I find particularly interesting is that he isn't somebody whose entire career has revolved around UFOs. His work stretches back to the 1960s. The UAP papers only start appearing much later, around 2022. Now, that doesn't prove anything. A highly qualified scientist can still reach the wrong conclusion. And also, his credentials are not evidence that a UFO interpretation is correct. But I do think that the timeline is worth noting. And it's also of note that this isn't someone who built their career around UFO claims and then found astronomy. Boris is someone who spent decades in astronomy and then later began publishing work on UAP. And it naturally raises the question of, what caused this shift? What did somebody who had spent decades looking at astronomical data begin seeing or believe they were seeing to make him pivot to this subject in a manner worthy of such serious investigation? Zyliev's own specialist background makes this even more relevant. His work involves things such as high-frequency optical variability, radio spectrophotometry, and meteor photometry. In other words, he should be extremely familiar with things like sampling, atmospheric interference, image scale, signal to noise, point spread functions, transient phenomena, and the difference between a real signal and something created by the imaging system itself. These are exactly the areas that matter when analysing something like this. Before we continue, remember to like and subscribe and hit the hype button. It really helps massively. It's down near the comments and it's only available for about 5 days after release. So it helps smaller channels like this kind of get more visibility on the platform. And also at the end of this video, I've got a couple of channel updates, mainly for members and subscribers. Also, shout out to NeuroVX and Guccio72 for becoming stakeholders in the channel, and also Hernan, fantastic footage he provides relevant to some of the previous cases. Going forward, if there are any questions raised in the comments that need a longer answer, I'll cover those at the end of the podcast episode released the following week on the @Plausible Pods YouTube channel. It just means I can give them a proper answer rather than typing the same response several times. I still read every comment, and I'll continue prioritizing replies as well where I can. But back to the case. So the next person, the second author is listed on the paper, is Vladimir Petchikov. So Petchikov was a little harder to trace because there are several researchers with similar names, but the correct researcher appears to be Vladimir M. Petchikov, listed on the main astronomical observatory as lead engineer. And again, he has a history of astronomical imaging work with Xiliev before their UAP publications began. One particularly relevant paper comes from 2018. This is titled On Reconstruction of Astronomical Images in Observations Through Turbulent Atmosphere, which is rather relevant to the discussion about whether these researchers understand atmospheric and imaging artifacts. That paper involved reconstructing astronomical imagery affected by atmospheric turbulence. Again, this does not mean that their moon UFO interpretation is correct, but it does mean that dismissing the authors as people who simply don't understand astronomical imaging would be difficult to justify. Then we have Sergei Pokovala, who is also referred to on the observatory website using the Ukrainian form of his name, Serhei Pokovala. You can see he collaborates quite frequently with Boris and Vladimir. The main astronomical observatory lists Boris, Vladimir, and Serhei within the same laboratory and their respective positions. The Russian-derived English forms of Vladimir and Sergei are the Ukrainian forms, are Volodymyr and Serhei, just of note. More importantly, the observatory's own bibliography shows that Pokovala also has astronomical work stretching back well before the UAP papers. There are publications involving astronomical imaging, CMOS cameras and photometry going back to around 2011-2012. So again, this isn't somebody who suddenly appeared in 2025 attached to the UFO papers. All these authors have traceable backgrounds in astronomy and astronomical instrumentation. Interestingly, some of the old external links from the observatory bibliography are now dead or have been hijacked and redirect to unrelated websites, such as Russian casino websites and stuff like that. But the publication records themselves remain listed by the observatory. So at the very least, we can establish this. These are legitimate researchers working within an established astronomical observatory. That doesn't prove their interpretation, but it certainly changes how seriously I think the observation should be treated. So the elephant in the room here is the peer review. Now, we need to address this obvious criticism. The Moon paper is not peer-reviewed, and that does generally matter. Peer review scrutinises a paper's methodology, its measurements, and its interpretation independently, which is necessary to rule out any bias. It's essentially another set of highly critical eyes looking at the work and asking serious questions about it. The papers we're looking at here appear to be part of an evolving series of preprints, as we can see. That suggests that these researchers may still be developing the work and releasing the progress as they go. It is of note that being a preprint does not guarantee that a final peer-reviewed paper is coming, but from this process so far, it could potentially be a possibility at some point in the future. What it does mean is that this work has been made public before formal peer-reviewed publication. So for now, the correct position would probably more be like interesting research from experienced researchers, but not an established scientific fact. And frankly, I think that's where things become fun, because we're not looking at settled science, we're looking at an active mystery. So then if we ask the question, what equipment did they actually use? This brings us to something that bothered me. When I heard Avi Loeb discuss the paper, I was a bit taken back. In an interview, Loeb said there are better ways to observe the moon than using a single 6-inch telescope from Earth. And yes, that is technically true. There are obviously better ways, better instruments to use. But I found his wording and his demeanour quite dismissive, which is not the Avi I think we're used to. Certainly I speak for myself on this, but it wasn't the Avi that I recognise within this phenomena. Perhaps he was having a bad day, who knows. But saying a single 6-inch telescope, that leaves out almost everything else about the observation. A few specs on the equipment show us that this telescope was an Intez Ultra M603. it was coupled to an ASI 294 Pro astronomical camera. The observations were recorded with the time resolution of 0.02 seconds. The researchers applied offset, dark frame, and flat field calibration. They used SharkCap 4.0 for acquisition, and the resulting data were processed in MATLAB. This is not just someone holding up a phone against a cheap telescope. This was a purpose-built, cooled astronomical camera attached to a dedicated telescope system. The calibration process they followed by using offset dark and flat field correction is standard professional astronomical practice, and the subsequent use of MATLAB for numerical processing and analysis is entirely consistent with established astronomical methods, and used in many other areas of physics and in maths as well. So this wasn't simply somebody taking a photograph through a telescope and guessing what they saw. And this is why this dismissal by Avi was a bit of a surprise to me. I have to state as well, though, that the professional equipment doesn't guarantee a correct conclusion, but the converse of that is that the equipment itself isn't a reason to dismiss the observation. So could a 6-inch telescope even see something that size? This is where Avi's wording becomes even stranger to me. The researchers estimate some of the alleged objects were at around 14 to 36 kilometres across, assuming they're at the lunar distance. So a 36-kilometre object at the moon would appear substantially larger than the theoretical resolving limit of the 6-inch telescope. Even something around 14 kilometres across would still be large enough to appear. So the important scientific question isn't really, could this telescope detect something that large? It could. The much more important question is, was the object actually at the moon? Because the physical size estimate depends entirely on that distance. If something appears against the lunar surface but is actually much closer to Earth, the same apparent angular size could represent a vastly smaller object. And that, for me, is one of the genuine questions in regards to the paper. Essentially, they can measure how many pixels across a feature appears, but converting those pixels into 36 kilometers relies on the assumption that the object is essentially at the lunar distance. Much like my other videos when we do the image analysis. Ultimately, these guys know far more about this than me, so I'm not going to pretend I can put forward a meaningful plausibility rating. There's a genuine gap in knowledge here, and until the methodology is independently reviewed, I think the fairest position is to leave the question open. But what we can say is that these astrophysicists did not simply view something and say, that looks like a spaceship. It's far more rigorous than this. So the counter argument of this is a 6-inch telescope, case closed, is a bit overly reductive, as it were. This is where I have a slight frustration with Avi's response. And I say this is somebody who actually agrees with a lot of what Avi has said previously on this topic. In fact, he's a bit of an inspiration for me to do this channel, knowing that it's okay to stick your head out there and approach these topics. But then his tone doesn't really seem to align with that. Saying there are better ways to observe the moon than a single 6-inch telescope doesn't actually explain the observation. At most, it tells us that we should obtain better observations, which I agree with. But until that happens, saying a better telescope exists doesn't tell us what these researchers found. And that distinction matters. So here's where I think it gets quite interesting. And I was debating whether to put this in at the start or to continue the process. I mean, I've just continued the process. We've always had the intro with the research and everything. Now, the interesting bit. Avi then points toward NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter as a superior source of lunar information. And don't worry, after this point, I will move away from Avi, but it is of note that he has publicly criticised NASA when the 3IA Atlas situation was going on. This, though, was before his current position as head of the UAP Science Advisory Council. But he is right, the LRO is vastly more capable of mapping the lunar surface. But this opens up another question. How reliable is NASA? I have mentioned NASA in some of my previous videos and highlighted issues such as so many military professionals being assigned to NASA at all different levels, including the very top echelons of the organisation. And this is very strange for a so-called public organisation with supposedly transparency regarding their data and mission objectives. Even looking into the recently released Department of War UFO files, we can see this. In my own opinion, based on looking into this subject for many years, I can say the plausibility that NASA is a transparent organisation is very low. But we should remember that line, transparency regarding their data and mission objectives. So let's see how complete their data set is we're comparing against. Because if we're going to say NASA has better equipment, therefore these Ukrainian observations can be dismissed, then I want to know exactly what NASA observed and when. And this is where I ended up going considerably further down the rabbit hole than I expected. Take Artemis 1. NASA says the mission launched with 24 cameras in total. 8 of these were associated with the SLS launch system and 16 travelled with Orion toward the moon. So I asked what seems like an obvious question. Can we watch the complete, uninterrupted camera footage of Orion around the moon? No. There are videos, there are photographs, but there isn't a single continuously available piece of lunar footage covering the entire trip. Now, that does not mean automatically that something suspicious has happened here. The cameras weren't necessarily designed to run continuously and survey the lunar surface, but there could be perfectly ordinary reasons for why there isn't this continuous public video available. But equally, if someone invokes the space agency as definitive evidence against transient phenomena, then the temporal coverage of all their missions matters and it should be subject to scrutiny. And this lack of continuous video around the lunar surface is not just with NASA. This isn't really an American issue. We often become very American-centric when discussing lunar exploration. There have been many other missions from other countries. So Japan's Kyuga Selene mission, for example, carried a HD TV system while orbiting the moon. Yet what we publicly have are selected sequences rather than full uninterrupted mission footage. Again, there may be completely reasonable explanations for that, but after more than 6 decades of lunar exploration, I could not find a single mission that provides continuous, uninterrupted, publicly accessible video surveillance of the entire lunar surface. That's an important distinction. We have spectacular maps, we have extraordinarily detailed images. What we don't have is a continuous raw footage of even one of these moon missions. So do we seriously think in all these missions spanning 6 decades, not one of these has continuously recorded footage of their mission? Then let's go to the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, as it was deemed by having more reliable and implied more trustworthy. The LRO launched in 2009 and has been orbiting the moon ever since. Its imaging system, LROC, contains 2 narrow-angle cameras and a wide-angle camera. It has photographed the lunar surface in astonishing detail, and the raw image archive is enormous. We're talking roughly 3.8 million archived images over the mission timeline. So there's some rough averages here over this operational lifetime. It comes out to about 244,000 images per year, 20,000 images a month, 670 per day, or roughly 28 images per hour. So I decided to look at the monthly release figures, but before around 2018, the releases were generally quarterly. After 2018, that period, the archive becomes much easier to inspect month by month because they were released on a monthly basis. And one period immediately stood out. So in this table, you can see there is one large outlier. This is for the releases covering approximately the 16th of November to the 15th of December 2019. It contains only 12,746 EDR images, which is far below the roughly 19 to 21,000 we often see around. At first, that looked like just a low month, but then I noticed the folder naming convention. The directories use year plus day number. So 2019-2020 means the 320th day of 2019. And when you follow that sequence, the images continue normally through 2019, 337, which corresponds to the 3rd of December 2019, and then they stop. The next acquisition day folder doesn't appear until 2019, 353, which is the 19th of December 2019. So in the public LROC folder, we appear to have imagery that ends on the 3rd of December. Then there's no imagery at all from the 4th to the 18th of December, and then the 19th of December, the imagery starts again. That's about 15 days unaccounted for. Now, this does not mean NASA deleted 2 weeks of UFO footage. We can't say that. But there is a gap in the imaging of the LRO of 2 weeks in this period. So why are there no publicly archived LROC images for those dates? And interestingly, the official errata file doesn't appear to explain it. Other errata records contain explanations for processing problems and missing products, but I couldn't find an explanation there for this particular gap. So, was the LRO itself offline? This is where it gets even more interesting because LROC was only one instrument aboard the LRO. There were others, and all others still seem to be producing archive data. So we have Diviner, which is a 9-channel radiometer and it measures reflected sunlight and emitted infrared radiation from the lunar surface. Essentially, it gives information about surface temperature and thermal properties. Diviner has archived data through December 2019, so no gap, it's all up and running. Then we have LEND. LEND, which is the Lunar Exploration Neutron Detector, measures neutron emissions from the lunar surface and is particularly useful for investigating hydrogen and possible water ice deposits. Again, archive data continue, no gap, it's up and running. Also, we have Crater, which is the cosmic ray telescope for the effects of radiation. It measures the radiation environment around the moon and investigates how energetic particles penetrate shielding. Crater has archived data on the 4th of December 2019, and it continues all the way through. But there is some missing data here on the 12th and the 13th of December. This wasn't running. So Crater is supposed to continuously run throughout the orbit. It's not on these dates though, and these dates align with when LROC was down as well. But it shows the LRO itself was still up and running. This doesn't appear to be a spacecraft-wide shutdown for the LRO. It appears to be something specific to the LROC imaging record and possibly a little bit of Crater as well. And again, this might have a perfectly ordinary explanation, but I can't find it. Where normally they do give explanations for such things, as per the other error reports, they don't in this situation. So when we say that NASA has reliability and transparency, are we right to raise a brow at this statement? I did go a bit further down the rabbit hole here and questioned, can we use another instrument to investigate this downtime? This is when I started wondering whether we could use specifically Diviner data to look at what the moon was doing during this period. I'll put the Diviner archive up, and this data set is enormous. We're talking possibly around 90 gigabytes compressed for the full period we're interested in. Fortunately, each 10-minute data file comes with a small .lbl metadata file that essentially gives us 10-minute summaries of that finer data. So instead of downloading anything, I began randomly sampling some of these labels, and this is where I initially thought I'd found something incredibly strange. So the 2nd of December Diviner gap, I found this file. I'll put it on the screen, and also it shows, I'll compare this to the one afterwards. And so here we see the 0400 file is normal. It contains a full 10 minutes of data. Then the 0410 file begins normally but stops at around 0412. The next data set doesn't resume until approximately 0422. There is an exact 10-minute gap. Now, when I first noticed this, I thought, hang on, I've found a 10-minute sensor blackout immediately around the same period as the missing LROC images. That would have been extremely interesting, but then I realised I mixed up the dates, and this was actually the 2nd of December. So the longer LROC archive gap doesn't begin until after the 3rd. But ultimately, there is a gap here, somewhere we didn't expect. So again, missing data, albeit only 10 minutes, but it's still missing data. And this is where following the evidence becomes more important than protecting the mystery. This was a long process, and it was the wrong day. As I've stated previously, with the time constraints, it's not practical for me to go through this stuff as much as I'd like to. But I'll put the link to the Diviner parent folder below. And what I would look out for, if anyone wants to look for this for themselves, what I would look out for is perhaps, like in this example, put it on the screen, you have the CH channels 3 through 9. If these perhaps show some variation out of the norm, and the norm seems to be about, I think it's like minus 200 to 400 in certain areas of the lunar surface, these can change naturally. But I would look at these and try to spot a variation that's out of the ordinary, and then it's a case of downloading the .tab file to get the raw data for that period. But if any of you guys do spot something in these files from the .lbl files, if you give me the file number, I'll check it out. But for these folders, it's the 2019, and then the last 4 digits are the month and then the date. For those interested, well, I did cross-reference the spike in the 2nd of December data with the images on the LROC, because this was still running. It was outside of that gap period. It turns out this section of the moon was just strongly illuminated. It was close to lunar daytime conditions, so the lunar surface was probably just became quite hot. I did check as well either day going forward and back to see if this was some sort of regular shutdown. And that's what I say, it's probably out of 2-3 days worth of data, and there doesn't seem to be a regular shutdown. So again, this 10-minute shutdown is a bit strange as well. Why is there missing data here on this 10 minutes that was outside of the one that we were even examining, to be honest? So where does this leave us then? This is where I think the story becomes far more interesting. In the one hand, we can't say that professional astronomers found 36 kilometer alien spacecraft around the moon. But in the other hand, we can't also dismiss their findings based on equipment, as this doesn't resolve the underlying anomaly from reliable source. Ultimately, these aren't amateur observers. They have relevant backgrounds. Their equipment is capable of detecting features with the claimed sizes. Their imaging methodology uses appropriate calibration techniques. And then we have the so-called more reliable sources who have surveyed the moon for over 60 years. And we do have extraordinary data sets, global maps, individual raw images. But what we don't have is uninterrupted visual footage of the moon during any number of these numerous missions. Further to this, there are obvious gaps in NASA's data, the 2-week gap, the 10-minute gap. And this was just in the small couple of days of data that I looked at. And in this data, everything else was up and running. So how is this reflected across their entire data set? Also, a 36-kilometer object appearing for several seconds, then disappearing, creates a very finite observation window nonetheless. You need to be looking at the correct place, at the correct time, with the correct instrument, and actually record it. And this is the same with all UFO phenomena as a whole. Every now and then, amongst these thousands of videos, excluding those that turn out to be balloons, aircraft, camera artifacts, satellites, or simply misidentifications, you get the cases whereby the answer isn't immediately obvious. And those are the cases that I find interesting. I've mentioned before, based on my own account, I have seen objects that totally defy an object that totally defies our current understanding of physics. But I resist the temptation to call it either NHI, but I also resist the temptation to totally dismiss the prospect of NHI, because somewhere between either of those two could be the answer. Thanks for watching. If you've made it this far, like and subscribe for more of these videos. Hit the hype button. Again, it's near the comments. It disappears after 5 days though, but that helps massively. Also, the membership options are available as well for the channel, just to show support and everything. So what I'm going to do with the membership going forward, I think when we have a few more members on board, I'll be receiving ideas. I'll take ideas from everyone about videos to cover in the future, and then we'll put it to a poll as well within the members that everyone can vote on. And then maybe once every 6 weeks or so, I'll cover one of the ideas selected by the members. But we need to get those member numbers up slightly first before we do this. Also, I might start some sort of Discord channel or something, or chat somewhere for us all that we can put ideas forward and stuff as well on there. But again, thanks for watching. Take it easy. See you next time. So to start, I feel a lot of the questions were answered in the video, but perhaps I skimmed them too quickly. So I'll delve a little further. I'll combine several questions first to give a more fluid answer. So several people question how to obtain the sling around the object, why use a sling at all, surely something more secure for transporting a load, the fact there's no ground crew present as well. Well, why use a sling and how to get the sling around the object are actually the same answer in many ways. Slings are most definitely used in recovery operation, as noted in the video. I even locate suppliers of such slings and locate potential candidate for the sling. If we imagine an object that would need to be retrieved from a totally inaccessible area, then the best approach would be by helicopter. Remember, there's no road or any other access. You can't get machinery in to recover such an object. Therefore, a quick operation to literally pull an object from an inaccessible area to somewhere accessible to further secure the load for onward transportation is like an emergency restricted equipment type operation. So the best way would be a sling. Especially for something that's shaped like this, you could lay the sling down and winch the egg onto the sling and then retrieve the object. It would literally be one of the quickest methods under the circumstances. So then presumably fly to the nearest suitable location to secure the load further. Hidden from sight from passers-by, as you don't want to signal to everyone what the object is. Even for a hypothetical advanced aerospace engineering project, let's just say, this would be a highly secretive operation. You wouldn't want to highlight the load. You would have minimal people involved. So you have an object from a chopper dangling at about 150 to 200 feet at night time. I would keep as far away from that load until it's fully landed, really. That is likely why there is no one in sight. Many people say about ground crews, which, yes, a proper landing location, that's already secured. I get that. An improvised site in the middle of the night, I doubt they would be that close to the helicopter, as if it were dangling with a 55 meters cubed object with a potential of acting like a pendulum at night, which you can't see. Also in the video, we can see the light directed from the top left. It's likely this is where the ground crews would stand, the backs to the light source, which I do state as well in the video, which was something that came up in the comments, but I just stated quite briefly. It is likely IR light due to night operations. So the ground crew would have limited area to stand. The backs would generally be against this light to maintain sort of visual contact with the load. So they would have limited area to stand. And in this video, also the edge that is closest to the drop zone, what I mean by this is it's only tens of feet to the edge of the screen in this location from the direction of the light. So it's entirely possible they were just out of shot and would only approach the load once it's landed. Don't forget, you not only have the load to contend with, but you've got the hook swaying at night also. So really, you would only approach when the hook is on the ground. So that's after about 50 feet or so in drop in altitude after the object has already touched down. So another question was about why don't they use chains? Again, I point to direct products available and within the US Marines multi-service manual. Also, most modern lines are in fact synthetic. Perhaps chains are still used, but the synthetic materials seem to be the standard, or if not the standard across realistic day-to-day operations, then they're definitely used and available. Another comment was the ground type. So the shadows in the video highlight the terrain well. So many comments say it's carpet and that kind of thing. It would have to be a very rough carpet with massive clumps congealed together to recreate this. Anyone can look at the shadow profiles on the ground in this video. You can see the differences in the profiles, especially in relation to the object. This shows that it's very unlikely to be carpet. It seems to be more of a rocky terrain, perhaps some shrubbery. I'm thinking along the lines of like a New Mexico type ground, but perhaps not precisely that. I think these were the main questions answered. I probably answered some of them better in the comments, taking my time to do each one, but going forward, I'm just going to make notes so I can address them all a bit more thoroughly than what I have done now at the end of each episode go forward. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please subscribe. Also check out the actual YouTube channel as well, Plausible ? And I'll see you next time.